Okay, so coming back to this, it's where we left off, speaking about transitions within the English language over time. As I said, do you think Shakespeare is different than the English we speak today? Well, how different than the English they were speaking back in the 10th or the 11th century? The excerpt, I should point out, is from Beowulf, epic poem written in English, kind of famous as the first extended Old English poem, not written in England as far as I recall, but nonetheless in the language to give a sense of the culture. And there at the bottom you can give a sense of the, it gives that idea of the warrior culture as well, very kind of atmospheric stuff, the representation of someone, almost this person in coming over the moors with the rain and the mist, wearing armor, holding a sword, all that captured in the poetic language. La komof mora under mislayotham, grendel gongan, goddess a bar, mintesaman shatha, manakinnis, somna baserwan, and saladam heyan, ward under walkdom, that the his windrekid, goldsel gemena, yarwas wissa, patum thachna, and wasa forma siv. Very kind of alliterative poetry. As you can see, sounds a little bit like Icelandic as well. So, suffice to say, English has changed dramatically since then. Unlike, say, a language like Icelandic, which has been more stable over time, so we have to ask the question, okay, why would it be the case that languages might undergo these transitions? We have a list of some of the transformations that have occurred in English since then. There's something called the Great Vowel Shift, which I won't speak about. It's more of a kind of linguistics topic that began in the mid-1300s. Basically, a change in how people pronounced vowels in English, some consonants as well. But here are some points that are worth dwelling on because they're more relevant to the class. Note that the second point that up to 30% of present-day English words are derived from French. One of the consequences of the Norman conquest in 1066. That was not the case when you're looking at Old English. That's its own separate thing. But subsequently, this language, the English language, gets flooded with French. And so that's really the reason why today French is a lot closer to English than a language like Icelandic. Even though English and Icelandic have the same roots, they're both Germanic languages, so they're kind of derived from the same branch, whereas French is a different branch. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the words in English and French are basically the same words. They're just being pronounced differently. And so that's part of the reason for the kind of close affinity between those two languages, and that was all due to the Norman conquest. That's basically what happened. They brought the French language, imported it. As I said, it became the language of administration, the language of high society within England. And then this merger, this blending together between the Normans and English was mirrored in the blending together of their languages. So if you study language, you can see the way that historical events, things that happened 1,000 years ago, are embedded, ingrained in something as simple as the way we're speaking today. So too, up to 60% of present-day English words, that includes the 30% from French, are derived from Latin. So this is the other reason why English has changed so profoundly, is it's stocked full of Latinate words as well. Basically what that amounts to is, in terms of the original Germanic language, it's only about 40%. The rest of it is this hybrid mixture of these other languages, and that explains, of course, the similarity not only to French, but other languages as well that have their roots in Latin, such as Spanish, for instance, close to English in many respects as well. Latin is an interesting story, too. Throughout the medieval period and up until the 1700s, Latin was the international language of scholarship, science, and religion in Europe. Up until the 1700s, Latin was basically playing the role that English plays today in the 21st century. People say English has become this international language, that if you're publishing something in scholarship or science, it's best to write it in English because thus you can reach an international audience quickly. And certainly when it comes to commerce and business, there's this understanding that English is typically the language that's conducted in to remove communication barriers quickly. Oh, that was the case with Latin up until this time. Basically, for hundreds of years, well over 1,000 years, if someone was writing something about science, for instance, best to write it in Latin, not your native language, because that way you can reach people who live in other places. Latin was the language of a ruling class, but also people who work in the arts and sciences, basically people who are literate, who are writing things, would certainly know Latin. Why was that the case? Well, there are different kind of understandings of that. They actually would have believed at the time, to an extent, that Latin is a better language than the other native languages. The kind of understanding, the assumption would be Latin is somehow a pure language or somehow closer to God's language or whatever you want to call it. English was kind of a vulgar language in the kind of common understanding of things. And you see that that legacy still continues to this day. When people use Latinate words with Latin inflections, there's this idea that it's kind of a more polite way to say something. Take the word defecate, for instance, right? Latinate word, the kind of Anglo-Saxon word crap or shit, right? You know, gives you a sense that that difference still persists to this day. But it wasn't really the case. There's nothing that makes Latin a better or purer or more polite language, because that's not true of any language. No language is inherently better or worse than any other language. They all exist on the same plane to a degree. No, simply because Latin was the language of the Roman Empire. That was the reason. Remember the map I showed you previously, the Roman Empire draped across Europe. Such was the case, the imperial state spreads not only their own military and their own infrastructure and their systems, but also spreads their language across Europe as well. But that's not even the kind of most startling thing. That's understandable. What's really incredible about that is the empire started to decline in the 5th century, the 400s. And look at how long Latin survives afterwards as an international language. By the time you get up into the 1500s, the 1600s, the Roman Empire is dead. Has been dead for 1,000 years or something like that. And yet its legacy continues to persist with its language ingrained, embedded in European culture, still survives to this day. Latin, for instance, the language they use in the Roman Catholic Church, language of the Vatican. Well, that's the story of English. I mean, if you want to understand how these things happen, there you see that when you tabulate the total number of countries in the world today, 195, although there's leeway in that because it depends how you count different places, but an extraordinary number of them, 67 countries, list English as an official language. And English is the most commonly spoken language in the world today. Anywhere from 1.2 to 1.5 billion English language speakers. Only Mandarin Chinese has over 1 billion speakers of a different language, but the key difference there is the overwhelming majority of people who speak Mandarin live in China, whereas people who speak English are all over the world. In fact, you can see that the majority of these people speak English as a second language. So if you speak English as a second language, you're actually in the majority of people who speak English around the world today. It's a smaller group that actually speak it as a first language. And also English proficiency is still increasing right now. You can see an instance of this. English is not official language in European countries, because they have their own languages, but it's certainly a very prominent second language in European countries. There you have a helpful map giving you a sense of the second languages that people are learning across the European Union. So if you're in Britain, it's French, it's the second language. In Ireland, Irish Gaelic, which we're going to talk about. But throughout most of Europe, it's English. That's the second language that most people are learning. And why? Well, the same reason as the Roman Empire, because English was the language of the British Empire. That is effectively the reason. It has nothing to do with this notion that English is easy for people to learn. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's only easy compared to what you know, right? If you speak a language that's very different from English, it's going to be harder for you to learn English. If it's similar, it's going to be easier. If you learn it at a young age, it's going to be easier. If you learn it as an adult, it's going to be harder. So it's nothing to do with that. No, it's just the language of the British Empire, which once encompassed 25% of the Earth's surface and fully 25% of the Earth's population as well. There you see the British Empire at its height in 1913, just before the First World War. And notice this telltale scattershot look of it. Unlike a lot of empires that kind of spread outward from a single place like the Roman Empire, this is kind of scattered all across the world. And note too that here you have countries that are part of the empire up until this period, and indeed corresponds to the map where they treat English as a official language. And as I say, English proficiency is still increasing to this day. I don't know how long that's going to continue, but again, the British Empire is dead. Crumbled, disintegrated at the end of the Second World War, but its legacy continues to survive in the spread of the language. And the United States was also once part of the British Empire, was an imperial colony up until the late 18th century. And think of the role that the American culture industry plays in spreading English today. Hollywood, films, TV shows, whatever it might be, right? That's promoting the spread of this language around. So who knows, hundreds of years into the future, even if the British Empire is consigned to the past, English might still be this language that is an international language we speak. The irony, well, here we have a kind of irony or a paradox, an interesting kind of point to bring up here. You could say that the English language has kind of been Britain's gift to the world in that sense, whether the world wants it or not, right? But it's kind of been one of those things that has ended up being the sort of, most prominent thing that Britain has kind of bequeathed to the world at large. And yet when you look at Britain, you don't find one variety of English. I mean, there's not one single form of English. Hence, as I said before, the kind of valorization of Shakespeare is almost this attempt to find that kind of ideal version of English. But if you just look at Britain, look at all the different varieties and dialects that exist in Britain today. And these really are dialects in the sense that some of them, I guarantee, are hard to understand, right? Someone stands in front of you, speaks in, say, Glaswegian, which is spoken in Glasgow, Scotland. I mean, it's difficult to tell what the hell the person is saying because it's such a strong dialect of English. Here you have regional dialects, the ones towards the bottom there. Scouse from Liverpool, Geordie from Newcastle, Brummie from Birmingham, Cockney, London, traditionally working class, Mancunian or Manc, Manchester, Tyke, Yorkshire, Glaswegian, Glasgow. Those are not the only ones, by the way, but those are some of the most famous ones. At the top there, you have what was once considered a kind of ideal form of English, the quote, the Queen's English, as they would call it, which is also known as BBC English or posh English, the kind of very high-class form of English. BBC, because they used to use posh English on the BBC, less so today. But if you want to hear a version of what posh English sounds like, just listen to the new monarch of Britain, King Charles. He speaks an incredibly posh version of English. Interestingly, his sons, Harry and William, don't really speak posh English. That's partly because it's just in decline in general over time. Now, suffice to say that there are probably going to be further dialects of English growing. I mean, there definitely are many dialects that exist all around the world, depending on what country you're in, what region you're in. People speak different dialects, they have particular accents, and they have their own vocabularies, even in places, of course, where they speak English as a first language, like America and Canada, for instance, a distinct form of English in terms of its lexicon, accent, all of those things. Well, even in Britain itself, you can see the pulls and influences of other languages. There you see the most commonly spoken second languages in the London boroughs today. And note the variety there. You have Polish and Turkish, Nepalese, Bengali, among various others. And it's safe to say that not only do you have people speaking these languages, but you also have the influences of those languages on English, introducing new words and new dialects. So I guarantee that will continue into the future. I said before that English is the language of Britain. Sounds like an obvious thing to say, and yet it's not completely obvious because it's not the only language of that country and never has been. And this is where we're going to get back into the history, the medieval period, to understand the cultural makeup and the sort of national construction of Britain as a country. We're going to speak about the four nations and their languages, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, continuity and discontinuity, an overview of the four nations, and the Celtic languages. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, that's the official name of the country. I've just been referring to it as Britain just for the sake of simplicity, or the British Isles as well. But if you want the official name of the country, that's what it is. And that sounds like a kind of a long, awkward sounding name for a country, mainly because it is, and it speaks to an entire history that's behind that. Again, we speak about ironies and paradoxes in history. Well, here is another one mentioned before. Britain has not been conquered since the year 1066, has not experienced a revolution since the late 1600s, which is also unusual. I mean, that's a long period of relative stability in a country. I mean, revolutions, they're not always common occurrences, but certainly there are things that happen around the world. You can read about revolutions occurring around the world to this day. So it presents this image of incredible kind of stability there. And yet, on the other hand, the country as a whole, as a political entity, is this kind of precarious construct that always seems to be on the verge of falling apart and nonetheless manages to hold itself together. And that's because it basically is a composite of four nations. We could mention others in there as well, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, four large, significant nations. You have England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are basically the nations that make up the UK to this day. Except people often have the impression that it's not really four nations as such, at least not in equal terms. That basically what you have is one big nation and three smaller nations that are in this kind of dependent position. And that's because England is and always has been the biggest of the nations. And thus it has been England trying to conquer the other places, right? That's basically what they've been trying to do since the medieval period, with varying levels of success. You want to break it down into the simplest terms. England has more people, always has been. It's the bigger place. Go back to the year 1000. So the population estimates, that's an estimate because they don't know for certain, but there you see right from the start, England with 1.25 million. Compare that to the other places, only 300,000 people in Scotland at this time, 150,000 in Wales, so not exactly teeming with people. They're not sure about Northern Ireland. Ireland as a whole, 630,000. Pay attention to that number. When you get up to 1,600, slightly larger, but notice again, England, obviously with more people, bring it up to almost the present day, 2022. One thing to note about that is that the discrepancies in population numbers have been increasing. If you just look at it proportionally speaking, yes, there are more people in Scotland and Wales today, but there are way more people in England. So there's kind of more people living in England over time. So this kind of imbalance in terms of the size of the nations is not decreasing, it's increasing over time. On the other hand, you could say that these other nations have been gaining more autonomy over time. Now, for instance, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland have their own parliaments. And they are sort of more, not independent political entities, but they kind of move a little bit more in that direction, whereas previously it was all coordinated with Westminster, with London. Indeed, there was a Scottish referendum not so long ago, and that was a referendum to decide whether Scotland was going to break free and become an independent nation. And that is hardly a dead topic for any of these places. Still something they speak about in Wales, in Scotland, Northern Ireland, the question of whether that would actually be unified with the Republic of Ireland. The reason for Northern Ireland's separation is an entire other story. Can't get through it in too much detail, but here are just some flashpoints, as I call them, in the history of the four nations. So, the present incarnation of this, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, has existed since 1922. So it's just over 100 years old. This is what the UK effectively looks like. So it's hardly a kind of permanent creation, could certainly undergo transitions in the future. The Troubles, as they were euphemistically called in Ireland, which stretched from the 1960s to the late 1990s, that was over the question of whether Northern Ireland was going to remain part of the UK or whether it was going to be brought into the fold with the Republic of Ireland. The Troubles, because there was violence that came with that, with different groups, competing factions on both sides. The IRA, most famously pushing for this idea of a unified Ireland, and loyalists in Northern Ireland pushing back against that. There's finally a peace agreement that was signed, although the topic is still kind of festering to a degree, not least because of Brexit. Kind of the issue with Brexit is the UK leaves the European Union, but Ireland is still in the European Union. So there's a lot of talk about, okay, what's the status of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? Something else to mention in relation to religion when we get there. Traditionally, this was a divide along religious lines in Northern Ireland. It was predominantly Protestant. In the Republic of Ireland, predominantly Catholic. The reasons for that we'll talk about later. Religion is still there, but I'd say it's more about national identity to the in this day. Should the people of Northern Ireland identify as being Irish or British, first and foremost? As I say, not exactly a dead topic. It's still certainly a live issue there. Scotland joined the Union in 1707. Scotland was not conquered in the end, but actually did join the Union sort of voluntarily. I mean, there's certainly elements of coercion that were involved in that, which I'll mention a little bit later on. But certainly the idea of Scotland being part of the UK has also never been this kind of settled issue. It's always been the understanding among people who live in Scotland that there should be the question, at least, of independence, whether Scotland would be a separate nation. Mentioned the referendum that they conducted in 2014, which was defeated 55% to 45%, so 55% in favor of staying in the UK, 45% in favor of leaving it. But also Brexit has kind of added another dimension to that issue as well, because the majority of people in Scotland voted to remain in the European Union. So it wasn't necessarily the people of Scotland who chose that, but rather the people of England. Scotland doesn't make up a huge portion of the UK population-wise, but certainly the influence of Scottish people has been incredibly vast, given the smallness of the country. And I don't mean large just in relation to the UK. I mean large in relation to the world as a whole, the kind of impact or influence of Scottish culture. You can see that just with the number of people who trace their ancestry back to Scotland, people who live in America to this day. It's larger than the total population of Scotland. But also look at some of the names of people who are Scottish or identified as being Scottish. David Hume, Alexander Fleming, Alexander Graham Bell, James Watt, Adam Smith, Thomas Carlyle, Robert Burns, Arthur Conan Doyle, and so on. Even J.K. Rowling, kind of identified as Scottish, depending on who you ask. The author of the Harry Potter novels, major figures, huge figures in science, philosophy, literature. And Wales, well, Wales was the nation that was conquered the earliest because it was always a smaller nation, really bordering close to England. Also, for a long time, Wales didn't really have much in the way of city centers. But nonetheless, that's also the place where the effort has been perhaps staunchest to preserve their language. The Welsh language. Approximately 21% of the people in Wales speak Welsh fluently, is much higher than in the other places. So the preservation, conservation efforts of the Welsh language have been quite strong there. You see a union that occurred in 1707, the famous Union Jack flag is actually a combination of flags of England and Scotland. You have St. George's Cross, a common flag used during the medieval Crusades, which we're going to talk about, later adopted as a national flag of England, and right, St. Andrew's cross used in Scotland as far back as the 14th century. Put them together, and there you have the Union Jack. It's supposed to kind of create this impression that this is a marriage of equals, but it never has been between two equals. It's always been England in the kind of position of oppressor as far as UK history is concerned. It's always been the question of the degree of separation or difference in these individual nations, and it has been the perspective in England for a long time. I think it's changing today, but traditionally speaking, there was this tendency to downplay the significance of the fact that the UK is this combination of different nations, because in England there was often this assumption that when we just talk about England, aren't we saying that, well, we're all British, we all just belong to the same national identity, so why even make these distinctions? Well, I mean, it's one thing to speak about being British, but it's another thing to note that the entire national cultural history is quite distinct. These are really different groups of people with different history. It even goes back all the way to the beginning of the formation of England as a nation. Again, the Anglo-Saxons conquered what would become England. The inhabitants of these places, Wales and Scotland and Ireland, were not Anglo-Saxons, not the same group of people, not with the same language, not with the same culture. So they were set out on different trajectories despite occupying close to the same area. I think you can see that to this day. I mean, it persists in all sorts of small ways, just as a kind of anecdotal version of that. I know, for instance, that when you take a trip into northern Wales from Merseyside. Merseyside is near Liverpool in the northwest. That's where one side of my family is from. Okay, so you go from Merseyside, England, into Wales. You will pass on the side of a road a big sign that tells you that you're entering Wales, and then you'll start to notice that the signs are all in Welsh. Well, if you're coming back the other way from Wales into England, there's no sign telling you that you're entering England, right? And the kind of idea is there's no reason to say it, right? It doesn't really matter. Isn't it all part of Britain? So it gives you a sense of that difference that I think still exists to this day. You see the differences most pointedly when you study language, Celtic languages and dialects. We're not really going to look at dialects so much, but how about the languages? Well, yeah, they have their own languages, and they are not similar to the English language. The Celtic language family is its own branch, really quite different from the Germanic language family. You have Scottish Gaelic, which I mentioned. Only about 1% of the people speak it, but its proficiency is increasing. Welsh, as I said, is the one that is spoken the most. You have Cornish in Cornwall, which is part of England, but they had their own language as well. And Manx from the Isle of Man. Those two extinct as a first language, but there are movements to revive the use of them. And one thing you can see when you put up these different versions, doesn't look like English. Really does look like a different language. Sounds like a different language. They just are different languages altogether. Trying to learn Welsh, for instance, it's really hard because it's just a totally different language. So just briefly, take a look at a case study here with Scotland and the 13th century to understand here a little bit of what happened. As I say, if you wanted to kind of boil it down to a simple historical narrative, England attempting to conquer the other places, right? I mean, that basically what it amounts to in terms of what was happening. But let's take a look at how that sort of proceeded in just one of the nations here. Scotland in the 13th century. Take a look at social and political unity in Scotland. Edward I's invasions of Scotland and William Wallace's resistance, and the Battle of Bannockburn and Edward II of England. You see a map of Scotland circa 1300. At this point, Scotland was a more unified land than either Ireland or Wales, which helps explain why it had retained its independence. By this point, not just Wales, but also Ireland had fallen under English imperial rule, whereas Scotland was still this independent nation, kind of more of a cohesive nation, not fragmented anymore. And there had been a kind of vigorous attempt to defend Scottish independence and identity. They were helped again by geographical factors, mentioned the mountainous region of the Highlands. Also, again, this kind of narrow neck to Scotland, which gives you a kind of good defense mechanism in the vast seaboard as well. However, not just military issues, but political issues enter into this. With the death of Alexander the III, fellow who reigned in the 1200s, there was a succession crisis, meaning a crisis as to who was next to take the throne. And this kind of triggered a sequence of events. Group of Scottish nobles appealed to assistance and help from the King of England, Edward I. So you can see his dates, 1272 to 1307. He was nicknamed Longshanks, Edward the Longshanks, due to his 6'2" height, which was unusually tall for the day. I mean, it maybe wouldn't stand out so much in the present day, but rest assured, it's very tall for a person to do back in the day. Malnourishment was a big factor in keeping people shorter at the time. And this is indeed Edward I Longshanks, the person who is portrayed in the famous film Braveheart, a Hollywood reproduction of the events that occurred at this time. Braveheart, an interesting film, but it doesn't really depict the events accurately necessarily. It's more just a kind of fun depiction of England's attempt to conquer Scotland, so you do have these characters represented there. Notwithstanding the negative portrayal of him in Braveheart, most historians agree he was well suited to be king, a proven warrior in combat, and a skilled military and political strategist, but also someone who put a high value on order and justice. Nonetheless, like most medieval kings at the time, he was interested in this concept of territorial expansion. So soon after he'd been invited to Scotland to handle this succession crisis, he decided that he wanted Scotland for himself. So he says, well, if you're looking for a king, how about I become the next king, or even though I'm already the king of England? And this triggered a prolonged struggle that would continue for a period of time, featuring William Wallace. That is indeed the person who is portrayed by Mel Gibson in Braveheart. And they're all these kind of homages and kind of narratives about William Wallace as this kind of a patriotic figure, this figure who defended Scotland from these foreign invaders. They even have a statue of William Wallace, except it is Mel Gibson, right? That's who they actually depict in the statue, in this kind of cheesy, kitschy looking statue. Now, William Wallace's role in not only defending Scotland, but also launching a fairly successful invasion of northern England, that historical event has been caught up with mythology. And this is exactly what I was talking about previously. You look at the history of a nation, especially when you're talking about something like this, the attempt on a foreign power to conquer a country, or say the origins of a country, you can bet that the historical record is all going to be caught up with mythology and idealized, and it's going to be turned into this kind of story of valor and courage. And that's exactly what's happened with William Wallace, and the film Braveheart is a testament to that basic idea. Nonetheless, what is true is that Scotland retained its independence despite the attempted conquest here. There you see Robert the Bruce. It's also depicted in this film. He led the Scottish forces to victory in the famous Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, which would settle the question for hundreds of years afterwards. Scotland remained an independent nation until semi-voluntarily joining in 1707. As for Wallace, he was indeed captured eventually. I don't think this kind of depiction of his fate actually made it into the film. It's too gruesome even for Hollywood films, but this would be what they would do to people who were accused of treason back in the day. Treason basically meant committing crimes against the king, not showing proper loyalty to the king. This was Wallace's fate, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The punishment involved hanging a person, hanging them for a long time until they were almost dead, then cutting them down while they were still alive, emasculating him, which means cutting off his genitalia, eviscerating him, which means cutting out his intestines, chucking these body parts into a fire, and then chopping off his head and 4 limbs. And if that's not all enough, the head and limbs would often be dipped in tar and then displayed in prominent places such as London Bridge as a warning to anybody who would think of committing a crime against the king. And so that was the fate that befell William Wallace. Typical medieval punishment. That's where that term comes from, medieval punishment, due to the gruesome brutality of some of the practices that existed at the time. The last thing I should mention here is Edward II, who was the son of Edward the First, who had a spectacularly unsuccessful reign as king, reviled for his sexuality. He might have been gay, although that's never really been kind of cemented, but also is lost to the Scottish at Bannockburn, and also for ruling during a period of famine as well. And this kind of brings us back to the sort of point I mentioned previously. Remember that the 1300s in Europe was the era of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which came through Europe. It was also a period of serious famine and starvation, caused by cold temperatures and torrential rain, which was likely caused by a massive volcanic eruption. This eruption, this volcano, probably erupted in what is now Indonesia. And there were some accounts that this was the largest volcanic eruption in thousands of years. All the ash that was spewed out into the atmosphere caused these cooler conditions in Europe for quite a period of time afterwards, so it had an adverse effect on their agriculture, their crops, and thus led to starvation at the time. So there's something to think about in terms of climate catastrophe, the way a volcano going off can not only ground flights, right, which happened with Iceland not so long ago, but can also, in fact, alter the climate for a period of time. And I think the last point to keep in mind with this is that the 1300s were an extraordinary period of hardship in Europe. Famine and the plague. It's as though these negative apocalyptic fates were kind of rolling across the continent, but in a way that set up what happened subsequently, which was the invasion of the Americas and the growth of European imperialism. Okay, so that's the end of that study for the test. Make sure you take the test on the Monday. We'll come back next week to talk about religion.